Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this afternoon's webinar, Asbestos and the Diseases It Causes with Liz Darlison. I'm Helen. I'm the Marketing Associate at UKATA, and I'll be hosting today's webinar, just ensuring really that everything runs smoothly, and I'll be hosting the Q&A session at the end of the webinar. So before we begin, just a little bit of housekeeping. The webinar is being recorded. We are going to share the recording with everyone after the session. If you do have any questions throughout, please do drop them in the Q&A box, not the chat box, as they might get missed. So we'll do our best to cover all of them at the end of the presentation. If any of the questions are missed, we'll pass them to Liz and we'll get back to you via email afterwards. If you do require any further support, use the chat box. If you're experiencing any technical issues, then just please leave the webinar and then just completely log back in. So, let's make a start. I'm really looking forward to today's presentation, and I'm delighted to introduce today's speaker, Liz Darlison. Thank you for joining us today, Liz. I'm going to switch my camera off now, and then it's over to you.
Lovely. Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. First of all, I'd like to say a big thank you to Helen and Craig and the team at UKATA for giving us this opportunity. Mesothelioma UK is very much about raising awareness, and we like to take any opportunity we can to just spread the gospel a little bit, really, about the current tragedy, really, I would call it, that the UK faces as a consequence of asbestos. So before I flick to my slides, I'll just explain a little bit about my role and what I do. So first and foremost, I'm a nurse. I'm a consultant nurse at the University Hospitals of Leicester, and I have specialised and worked in asbestos-related diseases for the last 20 years. It was through my role as a nurse that I first came into contact with people with mesothelioma, and that led me to work with Macmillan Cancer Support to establish a bespoke service, Macmillan Cancer Support Service for mesothelioma. That was 21 years ago, and over the first 3 to 5 years that morphed into Mesothelioma UK, which is the national charity for mesothelioma. So I've grown with that charity, I don't mean just in size, although I have grown in size as well, but just in the, I started off as nurse consultant with a couple of staff, providing specialist support services for people with mesothelioma, but it has grown into quite a substantial charity now, with probably around about 50 staff attached to it. So my role in the organisation has grown with that, and I'm the current chief executive of Mesothelioma UK. And I'm delighted that Craig, who heads up UKATA, is one of our trustees, which is a great relationship. For all sorts of reasons, we're all on the same journey. We're all part of the asbestos story in the UK. We might chip in at different parts of that journey, but absolutely everything that you all do is hugely important to addressing the asbestos issues that we have in our country. And I hope that by giving you some insight into the work that I do as a nurse and the work that I do with the charity, the team at the charity, complements what you are doing in your day-to-day role. And I just really want to say thank you for all that you do, and don't ever underestimate how important it is, because a little bit of insight that you give to people, the education that you share, could possibly just save their life, because none of us are spared, really, the possibility of being exposed to asbestos. And knowing about it is the best we can do. Educating people about it is the best thing we can do to help protect them. So please, I'm happy to take any questions at all. As Helen said, please put them in the Q&A box, and then she's going to help me look at those after I've finished presenting. And please do put some questions in there. There's nothing worse when you're presenting, particularly I think on webinars and Zoom and virtual platforms, because I get no feedback from the audience. Q&A is the only feedback that I will get, knowing whether or not what I've put together is useful. So just bear with me while I share my slides. And I'm going to assume you can all see that, because I can see it on my screen, and I hope that Helen will stop me if you can't. So I am going to talk about asbestos and the disease it causes, but I'm going to talk a little bit about why we're in the pickle that we're in with asbestos, and then also a little bit about the charity. So everything that I'm involved with starts and finishes with patients, with people that are living with mesothelioma now. And so it's no surprise, therefore, that I am going to start with a video of a patient. So make sure your volume's up nice and loud, because it doesn't always play as well. But I'd like to introduce you to Sue Farrell. Now, I won't play all of the video because it's only the first part of it that I think is relevant at this stage in my presentation.
So I had heard of asbestos. I was a child of the 60s, and it was a word that was thrown around throughout my childhood, teenage years. I didn't really understand the implications of the dangers of asbestos and what it can do to you. And I think I was probably thinking, like the rest of the public do now, that asbestos is safe because it's not used anymore. And it's only since my diagnosis that I've realised how dangerous asbestos is. Mesothelioma is a word I've never heard before. When I was diagnosed with it, I couldn't pronounce it, I couldn't spell it. I knew absolutely nothing about it. And I think that is the case for most of the public until they experience mesothelioma either themselves or through families or friends.
So I'm going to stop it there, because then Sue goes on to talk about Mesothelioma UK, and I'm going to use some more footage further on in the presentation. And I think Sue's very typical of a lot of the population. Didn't realise asbestos was a problem, never heard of mesothelioma, and yet, as I've said, asbestos presence is so widespread across the UK, nobody really is spared the risk of being exposed. I probably don't need to say this to any of you, but just for completeness, I've put in a slide about asbestos. It is a naturally occurring mineral, not found in our soil naturally in the UK. It's all been imported. And sadly, there's about 200 countries in the world, and I think it's probably banned in about 65 of them now. But the asbestos industry, generally speaking, is alive and well globally, despite the devastation that it causes because of its carcinogenic properties. The problems that we have in our country are due to the legacy, the ongoing existence of asbestos. We banned it in 1999, but we still have 90% of our hospitals with asbestos in them, 80+% of our schools still have asbestos, and that's just two public building groups. You know, I've can't tell you the number of people that I've looked after who've worked in libraries or worked on the railways or the prison service or the fire brigade or the police service. So public sector workers are at risk dreadfully, and that goes against what a lot of the people think about it being something that's exclusively affects the construction industry. I'm not going to talk about talc today, but talc is a growing concern. We are seeing increasing numbers of patients whose causation is thought to be due to talcum powder. Talc is also a mineral found in the soil in similar places as asbestos, and experts will tell us that it's impossible for talc not to be contaminated by asbestos. And so there are lots of legal claims and lots of appeals and litigation around the whole talc debate. And that's not just talcum powder that, you know, like baby powder that you splash all over yourself, but all compressed talc products. So all of your eyeshadows and face powders and bronzers and anything made of talcum powder. And again, this is against the belief of some people. All asbestos is carcinogenic, so that for a long time it was thought that chrysotile was not carcinogenic, and it isn't as carcinogenic as cricidolite and amosite, but we absolutely know that there are people that have gone on to develop mesothelioma as a consequence of being exposed just to chrysotile. Again, I think this is me teaching you to suck eggs a little bit, so forgive me. But, you know, we often talk to patients and say to them, have you been exposed to asbestos? No, they said never worked with asbestos. And I think, generally speaking, people don't realise how widespread asbestos is in general products in and around the average home in the UK, whether that's ceiling tiles or floor tiles, whether it's wall coverings or asbestos cement boarding, lagging, the ceilings, the roofs on our garages and so on. It literally is, you know, everywhere. I'm going to just play you this bit of footage. I found this many years ago when I was preparing for a presentation, and I think our main our major consumption of asbestos in the UK happened in the post-war years. And if any of you speak to elderly relatives about the housing situation in the post-war years, when the troops came home after the war, there literally was no rental accommodation available for them, and people were renting a room at Auntie May's, or they were living in a flat above a shop, two families in a room. And there was a real push in the 50s to put up what they called prefab housing to accommodate our growing population that happened in those early post-war years. And this Pathé News footage shows you the building of Bethnal Green. And I just want you to think about the cities and the towns that you all live in. I live in Leicestershire, and we have several housing estates that were built in exactly the same way as Bethnal Green. Now, these were meant to be temporary measures, but many of those estates are still there now. They may have been wrapped in bricks, or they may have been have a false a facade over the front of them, but they started off as prefab housing that sadly are still in existence today. So I just found this quite fascinating, and I thought you might appreciate me sharing it with you.
Florida Street, Bethnal Green, was the site chosen by the LCC for a housing experiment. Two prefab dwellings arrived by road from the manufacturers in Durham. The little houses were transported in halves to be joined together in a beat-the-clock operation. They're the first of 750 ordered by the council. The frame is of wood, the walls of plastic-covered asbestos. They have central heating by gas. The LCC's architect-designer timed the job. These days, everything has to be instant. In a day or two, the main services will be connected and the people can move in. They'll have a home of their own while waiting for an ordinary house. Far better than existing in rooms. So much for civilian.
So I think that just goes, most of you can recall estates in your own cities. And I just, I remember classrooms when we outgrew the size of our local village school, they just got these prefab buildings and added on another classroom. And as you heard them say, the walls are made of asbestos. So what are the diseases that asbestos causes? Well, these are the main diseases that asbestos causes, but there is also growing understanding about a wider set of diseases that asbestos can cause, but the evidence isn't as watertight. And I'm talking about esophageal cancer, ovarian cancer, but I'm not going to go into those today. These are the ones that are evidence-based that we know can absolutely be attributed to exposure to asbestos. And often it might be very clear to you after today what the difference is between them, but it often gets very muddled further down the line. And often patients get very confused as well. And they often, when you say to them, what have you been diagnosed with? They'll say, oh, I've got that asbestosis. When actually they've got a mesothelioma. So the terms are often used interchangeably, and it takes a little bit of digging, and sometimes we have to get medical records out in order to differentiate what the patient has been diagnosed with. But I'm going to start with pleural plaques. Oh, first of all, before I do that, I just wanted to show you this graph. Now, the yellow line here is when Mesothelioma UK started, or when I first started working in thoracic cancer. Mesothelioma UK we first started thinking about it in 2002. We actually opened our doors in early 2004. But you can see what the incidence was then of mesothelioma. Well, these are the mesothelioma deaths. So back when we first started to think about developing a national charity in the year 2000, there was around about 1,650 deaths, I think, a little bit around that number. And if we look further down the graph, you can see this here is the grey line further down is asbestosis. Now, asbestosis, you have to have pretty heavy exposure to develop asbestosis. And then the reddish line down the bottom here is pleural thickening. And the thing that just strikes me with all of them is that they've all increased. So over bearing in mind, we banned asbestos just before this yellow line in 1999. The death rates from all of these and the claims for industrial injury disablement benefit, which is one of the better barometers for looking at the incidence, have continued despite the fact that we have had seemingly rigorous controls of asbestos and we've banned asbestos. And the greyed out area here is COVID, because sadly the signs and symptoms of many of those asbestos-related diseases are very similar to the signs and symptoms of COVID, and the rate of people being diagnosed through COVID just dropped off a cliff. And sadly, lots of people were sent away presuming they'd got COVID and never did get a diagnosis. So I'm going to start with pleural plaques. And so this is a chest X-ray, and it's as if the person is looking at you, they're facing you. So the grey blackish area down the centre is their main windpipe. Then their left lung is on your right and their right lung is on your left. The diaphragm is at the bottom. This here, I hope you can see my arrow, where the black arrow is on the bottom right of your screen. That's the stomach, and that's a gas bubble in the stomach that you can see there. Everything black on a chest X-ray is good because that's air entry, because air does not show up on a chest X-ray. And where it's whited out, that's where the X-rays cannot get through very well, and it blocks the transition of the X-ray. So bones and major organs like your heart will block it. At the edge of the lung, where the arrows are, that should be black like the rest of the lungs, because there should be good air entry there. Well, that's a sign that this person has got pleural plaques. Now, they're an indicator of asbestos exposure, but generally speaking, they're not harmful. I don't think, prior to working in cancer, I worked, as I said, in a respiratory ward. I was a respiratory nurse. So I've met a lot of people over the years with pleural plaque, and I don't ever recall having anybody with any signs or symptoms of pleural plaques. It's usually found coincidentally. So often if you are having heart surgery or if you've got other health problems, a chest X-ray will be done as a matter of course. And it's there that we often pick up pleural plaques. People who are told they've got pleural plaques can often feel it's a bit like a sword of Damocles, particularly if they have worked in an asbestos industry or in a job that they know other people that have had asbestos-related diseases, because they often then worry that they may go on to develop more sinister asbestos-related diseases. Having pleural plaques is not compensatable in England and Wales, but it is in Scotland. So people who are diagnosed with pleural plaques in Scotland can go through a claim process and be compensated. They used to be able to do that in England, but it stopped, I think, around about 15 years ago or something. So it's a benign, you very rarely know about it. It's found coincidentally, doesn't cause you any health problems. But once you know, psychologically, it can be a bit of a burden to know that you've got pleural plaques. And it's a sign of asbestos exposure. In a more progressive state, that asbestos exposure can go on to thicken much larger areas of your pleura. Now, your pleura is like in a healthy person is like, it's a membrane. It's like a skin on a sausage. So you can almost see through it, and it's got that visceral, greasy feel to it, much the same as the skin on a sausage. The pleura is made up of two layers. One's attached to your lungs and one's attached to your chest wall. And it enables your lungs to expand and contract, and your chest cavity to expand and contract, and your lungs to glide over your fixed chest wall and your ribs without any discomfort. In between those two layers is a bit of fluid that swishes about to help with that whole breathing process. Now, this is a CT scan, so not a chest X-ray. If you imagine somebody laying flat on their back, their feet are towards you and their heads away from you. The little white bit of bone at the top of the scan is their breastbone. The big white circle in the middle is their heart. Their left lung is on your right, and that's the smaller lung, and their right lung is on your left, and that's the bigger lung. And around most of the edge of the right lung, which is on your left, remember, you cannot see anything around the edge of that lung. It goes from black to straight, thick, dense white, and it's very smooth all the way around the edge until you get down to the bottom near the backbone. You can see the backbone at the bottom of that image, and you can see on both sides of that backbone of the spine, you can see thick lobulations, a thickened area with its ragged edge, and this is pleural thickening. So this is where the asbestos has been breathed in, worked its way to the edge of the lung, embedded itself in that pleural lining because it can't work through it. It's indestructible, remember, this asbestos, so it lodges itself in that pleura, and over a period of time it causes this inflammation and swelling, and the area then eventually becomes thick and hardened. And I always try to liken it to people a bit like if you imagine a pair of shoes, ill-fitting shoes, that over a period of time rubs and you end up getting a blister and a thickened, swollen area that's painful and uncomfortable. And then if you carry on wearing them shoes, eventually that blister on the back of your heel becomes like a thick, hard callus. That's exactly the same that happens in your lungs with asbestos. That asbestos fibre works its way to the edge of your lung, pokes through that pleura, and with inspiration and expiration continues to rub on the pleural lining and causes this thickened area. Now again, benign pleural thickening very rarely causes symptoms. I've seen the odd patient who's got quite advanced pleural thickening, or they've got very poor underlying lung function and a little bit of pleural thickening has just tipped them over the edge. But it is a sign of exposure to asbestos. I have to say, though, there are other causes of pleural thickening. So I don't want to go into them today, but there are some other medical conditions and diseases and ill health that can cause you to develop pleural thickening. But exposure to asbestos is a very well understood cause of pleural thickening. And the sad thing is here that about 15% of people who have developed pleural thickening as a consequence of exposure to asbestos will go on to develop mesothelioma. Pleural thickening in itself, as I said, may make some people more breathless, or they might have some pain, and it is compensatable depending on the level of debility. So it's not a given that you'll be compensated. There used to be a rule of thumb that 25% or more of your total surface area of your lungs had to be affected. But it also has to be accompanied by some degree of debilitation, from my understanding. So that's pleural thickening, and that's a CT scan that's showing that image quite well. Now, they're both what we call benign problems, and you may not know you've got them. Asbestosis, again, is still benign, so it's not cancerous, but this is where the asbestos fibre, instead of working its way to the edge of the lung, it's actually embedded itself in the lung tissue itself. And remember, I said to you that it's indestructible, but your body will try and get rid of it. It will engulf it. It will saturate the area with secretions and fluid, and all of your body's defense mechanisms will try to rid that foreign body from your lungs. And it is that inflammatory process, that defense mechanism process, that will cause scarring in your lungs that we call asbestosis. And it's when it's become scarred like that, oxygen and carbon dioxide can no longer be exchanged. It's a very thin membrane where that exchange process takes place, and you can imagine if you've had asbestos fibre in there causing inflammation and then swelling and hardening over a period of time, then it stands to reason that eventually that very subtle exchange of gases cannot take place. And asbestosis is progressive, increasing areas of the lungs are affected, and it's not surprising that the person becomes very breathless. The secretions that we naturally have in our lungs tend to pool, they end up with lots of secretions, cough, and it becomes a very debilitating disease. And they eventually become a bit what we call a respiratory cabbage, in that they can no longer provide the oxygen their body needs even to walk or to do normal activities. There is no cure. There are some treatments, but then they're not, they're not brilliant, if I'm honest. And this is a typical chest x-ray. And remember, I said on a chest x-ray, everything that is really nice, crisp, black is good, because that's good air entry. But you can see both sides of the chest here are very white and fluffy, like cotton wool, which shows that air entry is inhibited. And that is the areas of asbestosis that have become hardened and thickened and scarred. So again, not malignant, progressive. And remember, this has continued to increase the incidence of asbestosis in our country. Now I'm going to talk about the 2 cancers that are associated with exposure to asbestos, but I wanted to put it in context a little bit. So cancer is a massive health problem in our country. There are about 200 different types of cancer. The vast majority of people who develop cancer will develop one of the top 4: breast, bowel, lung and prostate. And we know across all cancers, 375,000 people thereabouts are diagnosed. Lung cancer is, I think, the second most common cancer now, and 48,000 of those people are diagnosed with lung cancer. Now, if I just wanted you to look at the survival as well. So of all cancers, around 50% of people will survive 10 years or more across all of those 200 different types of cancer. The outcome for people with lung cancer is not as good. Only around 10% of people will survive 10 years or more. And if we look at how preventable cancer is, generally speaking, 38% of cancers are preventable. So if we just think about skin cancer, then preventing skin cancer is about safe sun, not using sunbeds, using high factor sun cream and so on. If we think about bowel cancer, breast cancer, all cancers, it's about exercising, being sensible with alcohol and avoiding obesity. The big thing with lung cancer, of course, is smoking. So the vast majority of lung cancer is caused by smoking. But look how common a cancer it is. 48,000 people or more diagnosed with lung cancer. And it's thought that 79% of that is preventable. So actually, it is over 20% of lung cancer happens in people who have never smoked. So please don't ever think that it is just a smoking cancer. It really isn't. And if you are not a smoker but you develop any signs or symptoms of lung cancer, you are still at risk. So you still have to bear in mind that just because you've not been a smoker, you are at risk of lung cancer. Now, lung cancer can also be caused by exposure to asbestos. Smoking's the main cause. If you've been exposed to asbestos, you are 5 times more likely to develop lung cancer. If you are a smoker, you're 10 times more likely to develop a lung cancer than a non-smoker. If you've been exposed to asbestos and you've been a smoker, it's not 15 times more likely. There is a synergy between the two, and it's actually 50 times more likely to develop lung cancer. Now, we have no way of knowing, of those 48,500 people diagnosed with lung cancer each year in our country, what proportion of them are due to exposure to asbestos, but it is a significant proportion without any shadow of a doubt. And that's a typical chest x-ray of somebody with lung cancer. It's exactly the same. The person is standing facing you. Their left lung is on your right side, their right lung is on your left side. You can see the heart, the white pear-shaped, kind of oval-shaped structure in the middle, and you can see just above the heart on the right there is a fluffy white shadow, looks about the size of an apple or a big tomato, and that is a lung cancer, and that's very typically what we see with a lung cancer. So here's the big daddy of them all, mesothelioma, and this is the disease that captured my passion and my enthusiasm many years ago, and sadly we have the highest incidence of this disease in the world. So mesothelioma is a cancer that affects mesothelial cells that are found in our covering and lining tissue. And that covering and lining tissue in the chest cavity is called the pleura, and in the abdominal cavity, it's called the peritoneum. 90% of mesothelioma affects the chest cavity, in that the asbestos has been inhaled, worked its way through its lung and lodged itself in the pleural lining. But a smaller proportion, less than 10% actually, affects the peritoneum. Now, it may be that the asbestos fibre has been breathed in through the lungs, worked its way to the edge of the lungs at the bases, and then gone through the diaphragm into the abdomen, or it's actually been ingested. So somebody has been eating food that has been contaminated with asbestos. That's the two ways that we believe that mesothelioma can affect the peritoneal lining. It's also possible to have mesothelioma of your testicles, the same mesothelial cells that are found in the peritoneum and the pleura line the scrotum, and that's all to do with how we are developed in utero. That when we're in our very early stages of development, it's just one big cavity, and the lungs and the abdomen and the testes are all in the same cavity. And then as we develop in utero, it breaks off into three separate areas that are not attached at all. Now, how the asbestos gets to the testes, we don't know. There's lots of different thoughts, but it is thought that the causation is probably much the same. Now, there's no cure for mesothelioma, but there are treatments, and the worrying trend is that the incidence has continued to rise until the last lot of data that was published actually, but that rise has been maintained by the increase in women, because the rate in men has started to drop off. And so that tells us in a way that it is more casual, indolent exposure to environmental asbestos that is probably keeping the incidence up across the UK. This is a typical CT scan of mesothelioma. So remember, the person's laying flat on their back, their feet are towards you and their head's away from you. The little round black circle in the middle is their main airway, and the two white circles in the middle, they are actually your main blood vessels. When we do CT scans, we give people a radio opaque injection that travels through their bloodstream, so their blood vessels show up, and then you can see the ribs around the edge because they're very dense and they don't project very well. And you can see that there's the left lung, which is on your right, the left lung's on your right and the right lung's on your left. And round the edge of that right lung, remember I said you shouldn't be able to see the pleura. It does not. The pleura is not big enough to show up on a CT scan unless it's diseased. But you can see at the bottom of that right lung, all the way around the bottom, there is thick nodules and lobulation. We call this lobulation or nodules, and this is very typical of mesothelioma. So the asbestos fibre been breathed in through the windpipe, worked its way to the edge of the lung, and over a period of time, through an inflammatory process, has caused this malignancy to get hold. It's a very debilitating cancer. Patients often present with breathless cough, weight loss, pain and fatigue, and it is always fatal. There are treatments available, but it is not a curable cancer. And again, just to put it in perspective, remember the statistics that we looked at previously. We don't even publish 10-year survival for mesothelioma because it just doesn't happen, or very rarely. It might be the odd 1 or 2 patients. And only 7% of people diagnosed with mesothelioma will survive 5 years or more. And when we look at prevention, remember, all cancer is 38% preventable. With mesothelioma, it's 94% preventable, because asbestos really is the only known cause. And that's the biggest sting in the tail for me, that this despicable cancer that cannot be survived, that could be avoided, we still have the highest incidence in the UK. So just to paint the picture a little bit more about mesothelioma, as I've said, the UK has the highest incidence globally. It's avoidable and universally fatal. Patients have a short survival, and that means we've got a really short window of opportunity as healthcare providers for actually getting it right with these people and getting treatment in. It's a really symptomatic cancer. Patients really do struggle with debilitating symptoms. It's rare, but has continued to increase. It's really hard to diagnose. Patients often go through lengthy periods of investigations and really difficult investigations, you know, major operations sometimes to be able to achieve the diagnosis. Because it's considered to be an occupational disease, not only are the patients having to navigate the NHS, and let's face it, with all the bad press that we get in the media, everyone dreads having to have any contact with the NHS. Even, you know, even having a baby nowadays is seen as being, you know, traumatic going through the NHS. For people with mesothelioma, because it is an occupational disease, they're entitled to pursue a civil claim, which means working with a lawyer to put together your case, and then suing your former employers or their public liability insurers. So they're going to have to more than likely navigate the legal system. And then also, because it's a terminal cancer, there are various benefits from the Department of Works and Pensions that you can apply for when you're diagnosed with a terminal illness. But because it's an occupational disease, there are also occupational disease benefits you can apply for. And also, because it's an asbestos-related disease, there's state compensation you can apply for. So you are going to have to navigate the NHS, the legal system, but also the Department of Works and Pensions. And bearing in mind, you've got a 60% chance of dying within the year. Can you imagine the burden and the trauma of having to navigate all of that while you're feeling so ill? So it's not surprising against that backdrop, we went on to develop a national charity to support these people living with this terrible situation. One patient that I met, he likened it to being, he was actually a professor of medicine who was exposed to asbestos in a hospital, and he died when he was 58 years old. And absolute tragedy. I've looked after so many doctors and nurses, honestly, I can't tell you. But he was a very articulate man. His name was Professor Kieran Sweeney. Please Google him, because there is footage on YouTube of him talking, and you can see him shifting all the way through the video because he's in pain. But he said, "I am a man devoid of hope." And he also said, "I feel like I'm walking on the edge of the human predicament." I mean, absolute poetry to me, but, you know, really captures the desperation that people feel. And this, as I said, was a professor of medicine. That's a map of, not of the UK, but of England, Wales and Scotland. And it shows you the red areas where we have the highest incidence. And remember, I said that asbestos isn't found in our soil naturally. So it's not surprising that our major incidence is along our major estuaries and our major ports where it's been imported and handled, with a smattering of other high incidence areas where we've had an asbestos industry or a shipbuilding industry maybe, or a steelwork kind of industry, that kind of thing. I've said to you about survival. 7% of people survive 3 years, and under 40% of people survive 1 year. So it really is a dreadful disease. I said that everything starts and finishes with patients for me. I'm just going to play you this little bit of footage now. This is Bob Mason, a patient that I looked after for quite a while. He died about 2 months ago. His funeral was actually on Workers' Memorial Day. That was the day of his funeral. And Bob worked 99% of his life in the prison service, ended up being a prison governor. Absolute delightful man. And I think he just captures the impact of having mesothelioma really well.
My name is Robert Charles Mason. I'm 83 years of age. A doctor came to see me. He said, "We have a bed for you, Mr. Mason." And I said, "The bed? I've only come for an x-ray." "Oh no, you're being admitted. The x-ray shows that you've got fluid on your lung, on your right lung." I went to a ward, and I had 5 litres of fluid taken from me in 2 different sessions. One of the doctors came and said, "Have you ever worked with asbestos?" And I said, "Not consciously, no." But he said, "It would look as though the cancer that you have is mesothelioma caused by breathing in asbestos dust. I've always been fit. I've always led a good active lifestyle. I've never smoked, but to take away all the positive activity, I used to ski, we used to walk in the mountains. We had a holiday home up in the French Alps, which we loved. We had to give it all up because I couldn't do that any longer. It just drains away at your energy. While you try to keep active, it doesn't allow you to do it.
Amazing man, and we're still in touch very close with his wife. So I said that we have our own research centre at the University of Sheffield, and one of the things the charity does is fund research, and we recognised that we were seeing more and more people working in jobs and careers not thought to be putting them at risk of exposure to asbestos. Now, that experience and that anecdote wasn't holding water with anybody, and the only way to evidence-base that was to carry out some research to capture these discrete groups of people who we were seeing in large numbers. And so our research team have conducted 4 studies now to look at these groups. One was the gendered experience study called GEMS. We were seeing more women, and we were also aware that women were taking longer to get diagnosed. Once diagnosed, they were less likely to have treatment, and also once diagnosed, they were less likely to get compensated for their mesothelioma. So we did a study to evidence-base that called GEMS. We recognised that a lot of people we were seeing had served at some time or another in the armed forces. Now, a lot of people do 4 years, 10 years, 12 years, but go on to have different careers miles away from being in the armed forces. So actually the exposure that was happening in the armed forces was not being captured. And likewise, we've had exactly the same experience with hospitals. And the MAGS report was dedicated to the lady on the front of that report, Margaret Portman, an amazing award-winning consultant medical doctor who died aged 42 of mesothelioma, only ever having been to school, trained to be a doctor and working in the NHS. She was an absolute inspirational lady, and I asked her if we could dedicate the report to her. So MAGS's Mesothelioma Awareness Guidance Study, and that talks about the number of people with a background in healthcare and what their unique experience is. And not pictured here is a study that we've done exactly the same for education workers, and that's called Muse. So please do look them up. You can get them on our website or on the University of Sheffield's website. But these are some of the findings that we saw from those studies. So you always think labourers get mesothelioma because they work so closely with these substances, but in the classroom, day in and day out with young children, it came as such a shock to us. And that was from the husband of a lady who died of mesothelioma. I never for a second thought the job I loved and dedicated my life to could give me a life-limiting disease. A sense of injustice that they were not kept safe when working to educate care for the public. I think personally now it's ironic that I've dedicated 44 years of my life, and that dedication is what's killing me. It's ironic, really. And so they're healthcare workers and education workers. And what we also discovered was the low index of suspicion amongst healthcare workers for mesothelioma in people who came from an educational healthcare background. So just to give you an example, they started asking me whether I'd ever been exposed to asbestos, and I was thinking, no, I don't think so. I did, and the chest surgeon, and he couldn't believe that a teacher would have it because I wasn't in any of the industries known for this disease. So the chest surgeon himself couldn't believe that a teacher was, and the others illustrate exactly the same thing, that the healthcare workers looking after them couldn't believe that they'd got mesothelioma. This is an article that was published in the Nursing Times in 2009. So just 5 years into me working exclusively in mesothelioma, and it was the story of a nurse who died of mesothelioma having been exposed in a hospital. And you know, the situation 16 years later is no different. I'm about to have my 60th birthday. I've worked 42 years since I was 18 in the NHS. This is my mandatory training record, and all the green is what I've done and all the red is what I should be doing. So forgive me, it's not up to date, but that's just the nature of the beast. But I have to do, actually the new training record, I have to do 36 modules of mandatory training to be able to practice as a nurse in the NHS. And in 42 years, never once has anyone said to me that the hospital contains asbestos. This is what it looks like. If you suspect there is some asbestos in a bad state of repair, this is what you do. And I've looked after colleagues that have died of mesothelioma, and that to me is an absolute scandal. As an absolute basic requirement, anybody working in a public sector building should be educated about asbestos, what it looks like, where it might be, and then there should be a fast track reporting system so that we can actually get somebody who knows what they're doing to come down and look at it. And I really want to congratulate UKATA, because they have actually been opening up education and training free of charge for people, so they can learn about just this. So we did have a select committee inquiry to look at the situation of asbestos in schools and hospitals back in 2022 it was, and the government's response was that they felt that there was a lack of evidence really, and they could not say that we ought to be removing asbestos because in terms of the reduced risk to building users, there just wasn't enough evidence for them to say that we should be removing it. And I'd just like to question that evidence. So currently, the government's understanding of the impact of asbestos on healthcare workers and education workers comes from data from the Office of National Statistics. And the Office of National Statistics publishes that on average, 7.2 people per annum die of mesothelioma from a healthcare professional background. And in teaching, it's 22.9. Now, the problem with that is that when people die, it's only their last occupation that is captured. And if you're 75 years or older, they don't document your occupation. And the average age of somebody with mesothelioma, unfortunately, is 74, 75, because it can often take 20, 30, 40 years for the asbestos to cause that inflammatory process. And so straight away, you can see that any ONS data based on occupation is not reflective for people with mesothelioma, because it's the last occupation, and it might be their occupation when they're in their 20s that caused them to be exposed to asbestos. Through the studies that we've done, which is the MAGS report and the MUSE report particularly, so the education workers and the healthcare workers. So this is a busy slide, forgive me, but the green arrows, the column beneath the green arrows shows the ONS data. So that is the data that's provided to the government to tell them about the incidence of mesothelioma amongst healthcare workers and education workers. The two orange arrows on your left, that is data from Freedom of Information requests our research team made to NHS resolution. If you're employed by the NHS and you sue them because they've exposed you to asbestos and you develop mesothelioma, NHS resolution is the NHS body that reviews that claim. And we did some FOIs to them, and what we discovered from them was that in one period of time, it was 41.83 people per annum that were successfully compensated, and in another it was 39.2, way above the 7.19 that ONS data that they publish. And then we also did some FOIs to the Department of Works and Pensions. Remember, I said that there is a benefit, it's called the IIDB benefit. So this is the yellow column F. If you develop mesothelioma because of being exposed to asbestos in a working capacity, you can claim industrial injuries disablement benefit, and they capture the occupation where the exposure occurred. So we did some FOIs to the DWP, and what we found from them was, over that time period, 65 people per annum were compensated or given the benefit for exposure to asbestos in a working capacity through the NHS, We did exactly the same for education. Now, there isn't an NHS resolution equivalent for the education workers, but we went to the DWP, we did 2 FOIs, 2 time periods, and lo and behold, it wasn't 22.9 as the ONS published, it was 70 people per annum. So we absolutely know that people working in a public sector job where low levels of exposure are occurring are definitely at much higher risk of being exposed to asbestos. So we would like to challenge what the government say, that there is sufficient evidence from their response to the Select Committee inquiry. I don't like to put money against the size of the problem. It seems crass to me that this is lives we're talking about. This is you know, husbands, wives, children's, partners, parents that are dying needlessly because of exposure to asbestos. But in order to add to the full picture, we worked closely with some partners, ATAC, ARCA, Unison, and Res Publica, and a lobbying group called Airtight and Asbestos, to assess the cost benefit of removing asbestos rather than carrying on with the same status quo that we currently have. And this is the list of the costs that we included in that cost benefit analysis. We had an economist actually carry this out, so it wasn't us, you know, it was an expert. And what we discovered was that if we did a rapid removal of asbestos over a 10-year period, then over a 50-year time horizon, that rapid removal programme would save the UK economy about 11.6 billion. And the public purse alone, it would be 3.6 billion. If we carry on as we are doing, removing asbestos in the same way that we are currently, they reckon it's going to take 400 years to get rid of asbestos. Now, I ask you the amount of people that are going to be exposed in that time. So I'm just going to finish with a couple of slides about Meso UK. It's against all of that backdrop that we developed Mesothelioma UK. We've only got involved more in awareness and campaigning for better management over the last few years, and mostly that's because those people we are caring for on a day-to-day basis will always say to us, please do everything you can to stop this happening to future generations. I don't want anyone else to develop mesothelioma. So basically, Mesothelioma UK, one-stop shop for anything to do with mesothelioma. We started off with just me and one other secretarial person back in 2004. And we now are 18 people in the operational team, and we have currently 28 nurses working across the NHS. We provide all of the services that you'd expect a health charity or a cancer charity. So we've got a free phone support line. We've run support groups across the country. We have got 3 members of staff who are dedicated to benefits advice. Remember, I said patients have to navigate the DWP and the legal system. We've got 3 people who are expert in that to support people. This is our tour de force, and these are our nurses, and this is our head office here in Leicester, where I'm sitting right now. And as I said, we've got currently 26 nurses, I think it is. We've been up to as many as 34. Lots of reasons why we're down to 26. It's not where we want to be. We'd like to be up to near 40. This is where they are, scattered across the country. We have got Scotland pretty much covered, Wales covered, Northern Ireland covered, lots of gaps in England, and most of that's down to income, if I'm honest. If we had a bottomless pit of money, we would be up to 40 nurses. We also, the nurses run a number of courses, lots of those are online, and they cover a lot of the nitty-gritty things around what it's like to live with a terminal illness. We run one for patients and one for carers. We are providers of information. We've got some bespoke services for armed forces and for people who develop peritoneal mesothelioma. This is a slide about our research centre at the University of Sheffield, who are prolific. They are the they are the most published research team in the world about patient experience in terms of mesothelioma. We're very, very proud of our research centre. We do an awful lot of media work. So I spent 40 minutes this morning on a call with a freelance journalist who makes really good documentaries, and they're in talks with the BBC. And we've got another one with Sky Telly next week, believe it or not. So we do an awful lot of work with media, journalists, and so on. We do an awful lot to try and get patients into clinical trials. In rare diseases like mesothelioma, there are very few licensed treatments, and so patients are far more dependent on getting into clinical trials to get access to novel drugs. And so we have a clinical trials app, and all of our nurses, chapter and verse, know inside out about the clinical trials available in mesothelioma. So that's the charity, and I just want to say that you could help us. We'd be very glad to get any of you involved. We are a very worthwhile charity, as I say, completely embedded in the NHS and trying to make this country a safer place, much the same as you in that respect, I guess. You could do a simple thing like join our lottery. You pay £1 a week, and it's like all lotteries. We have a number of different campaigns. So this month it's Muffins for Meso in May. So we're asking people to have a coffee morning and sell muffins and so on. We've got a light up blue for mesothelioma in July. We do a fitness in February. We also have a number of challenges. So our Ultra Challenge series is you can walk the Peak District, Hadrian's Wall, the Cotswold Way, you name it, the Thames Path. And we also have people doing the Great North Run and the London Marathon, the Manchester Marathon, all sorts of marathons. So please do a challenge and open up your Just Giving page and get people to donate. We're also really, really keen to get corporates to sign up to become either a partner where you give a regular amount each month from £50 up to whatever, or to join as a corporate supporter and make us your charity of the year, or to fundraise for us. So lots of opportunities to support us. And I honestly would say, I mean, obviously I'm very biased, but you'd be hard pressed to find a more worthy charity. And of course, there's always just, giving donations or thinking about us as a legacy or so on. So the take home messages: mesothelioma is a dreadful disease, and sadly the UK has the highest incidence of asbestos disease in the world. Thousands of people are dying unnecessarily. Our current manage in situ approach to asbestos isn't working, and we know that from the demographics behind the patients that we're looking for and the increasing incidence. We are particularly concerned about the amount of asbestos in schools and hospitals. There is a cost benefit, and as I said, it sticks in my throat to actually have to look at the cost, but there is a cost benefit for a rapid removal of asbestos, and we really do need a national urgent review of asbestos management and a national task force that spans several decades, because this cannot be sorted out by one political party in 1 or 2 terms of office. This is a national problem. It's nobody's fault. It's where we are. It's everybody's problem, and we just need to come together and work over several decades to address the situation. I'm going to finish with another video, and this is Emily Jane Scandrett, who is currently having treatment for her mesothelioma.
I'd never heard of mesothelioma before my diagnosis. I'd heard of the word asbestos before my diagnosis, but never really, I didn't know anything about it, just I'd heard of the word, and that is it. Mesothelioma UK have supported not just myself, but also my family. And they are there at the end of the phone if you ever need to talk. They're just a wonderful charity. And they also provide specialist nurses in various locations across the country. This is to help patients diagnosed with this incurable cancer, and they are so vitally important, these nurses are. I first became involved with Mesothelioma UK after my mum Googled the cancer and actually spoke to my Mesothelioma UK nurse. And then it just progressed from there. So my Mesothelioma UK nurse means so much to myself, my husband, and the rest of my family. She's absolutely wonderful. She's there at the end of the phone. There she gives good advice. She also gets scan results quickly for me if she can. She's just a wonderful, knowledgeable lady. If somebody was on the street and heard my story, what I'd like them to take away from this is that mesothelioma is real. Asbestos is still in buildings, and everybody is at risk. If you're considering reaching out to Mesothelioma UK, I urge you to do so, because they provide so much support, not just for the patient, but for the family as well.
And that's it. Thank you. I'm sorry I've gone on quite a bit, haven't I? So I'm sorry if I've kept some of you, but I'm happy to take any questions. I hope that was useful.
Thank you, Liz. That was really interesting and informative. And like me, I'm sure the audience got quite a lot out of that and learnt lots of things. So thank you again. We have got a few questions. So I know that we've reached the hour, but we will continue staying to answer some of those. So we'll crack straight on with them. The first question that we've got is from Spencer. And he wants to know, is there a percentage of asbestos removal contractors who develop mesothelioma?
So we know that you are obviously more at risk if you've worked in an asbestos removal capacity. However, I think I've probably looked after more people with mesothelioma than any other healthcare profession in the country. And I often say this to people, I think I've looked after more teachers and I've looked after more healthcare professionals than I have people from the asbestos industry, because the asbestos industry are protected. You know, you have protective clothing and you have all these measures put in place when you're working to remove asbestos, whereas people who are having that very casual exposure in hospitals and schools, it doesn't enter their head. You know, they don't even know the dangers. So yes, there is obviously an incidence amongst asbestos removal contractors, but I can tell you anecdotally, my experiences, I've looked after more people in other areas.
Right, great, thank you. The next question that we have is from Gina, and she wants to know, is pleurisy connected to asbestos exposure?
So pleurisy is you can get pleuritic chest pain or inflammation of your pleura for all sorts of reasons. If you remember, I said with benign pleural thickening, there are lots of things that can cause that. And then one of the most common things is a good old chest infection or a pneumonia that can cause your pleura to inflame and rub and cause you some pleuritic chest pain. So there are lots more reasons, lots more causes of getting pleurisy than asbestos exposure. But if you develop an inflamed pleura because of asbestos exposure, then you will get a pleuritic chest pain. So I suppose the answer is no, pleurisy is not connected to asbestos exposure, but you can get pleuritic chest pain when you've got an inflamed pleura through asbestos. Lots more reasons for getting pleurisy. Don't think if you've got pleurisy, you must have been exposed to asbestos, because that's not the case.
Right, okay, thank you for clearing that up for us. Our next question we have is from Andy, and he wants to know, why does the UK have the highest incidence of mesothelioma compared to countries which still mine asbestos?
So, I mean, it's a complex situation. So we have the highest incidence because we were one of the highest consumers of asbestos through the middle of the last century, and there is a latency period between being exposed to developing the disease. So we're still riding on the back of that high consumption. The other thing is as well, we have the life expectancy in the UK is very good. So people are living longer in our country, and that's providing a longer latency for developing mesothelioma. We're also really good at collecting data. We have a national cancer registry, and we capture data on all the diagnoses of cancer in the country, including mesothelioma. So if we just look at a lot of our asbestos came from South Africa. If you go to South Africa now, many of those asbestos mines are abandoned, but asbestos is still in the environment. You can see it on the roads and the paths and in the playground and so on. But the average life expectancy of people living in those rural areas of asbestos, rural areas in South Africa, is really low. So men on average don't live beyond 55, 60 at the most. So they don't live long enough to develop a disease that needs a long latency period. So that's just an example. So there's lots and lots of reasons why we have the highest incidence.
Okay, interesting. Thank you. Our next question that we have is from Derek, and he wants to know, with Muse in mind, what about the amount of children that will be exposed to ACMs, and what are the chances of them contracting mesothelioma?
So I can't spout the statistics for you, but there are. So Robin Howie is somebody who's done some statistical modelling. So there's some statistical modelling out there, and I couldn't quote them to you because I don't know them well enough, Derek. But you're absolutely right. It's wrong, because children are at risk. So if I just think about. Oh, if you Google Chris Willis, he was in the Sunday Times in that series of articles last year. Chris was a gentleman that I looked after. I think he was 36 when he died of meso. He was a school teacher, dedicated to teaching, only ever been to school himself, university, and then became a teacher and died of mesothelioma. My youngest patient I've looked after was 29, 30 when he was diagnosed, but we've had 3 or 4 children as well, and their only exposure could have been in school. So, I can't spout you the statistics, but there is some statistical modelling out there. There's some from America. But I can tell you, absolutely, it is a real concern that, while 80% of our schools still contain asbestos, we will continue to see people develop mesothelioma as a consequence.
Thank you, Liz. Our next question is from Darren, and he wants to know, do you have a percentage of ex-pupils that have contracted mesothelioma to date?
No, we don't. And it'll be really difficult to get it, to pin that down, because often people have had multiple exposures and you're not compensated as being exposed as a pupil. You get compensated for occupational exposure more easily. So no, I don't. But in the same way that I answered Derek, while we still have that level of, so there has been a number of reports put out lately that show how the bad state of repair of asbestos in our schools and how severe the exposure is. So it is a real problem. And where you've got exposure, you are going to get mesothelioma, because you do not need heavy exposure for mesothelioma, and there's no safe level of exposure.
Right, thank you. Our final question. Oh no, we've got a couple more. We've got another question from Spencer, and he wants to know, in relation to military mesothelioma, most armoured vehicles contained asbestos to the engine covers and taken off to work on the engines. And troops also used to sleep on top of the louvered vents directly above the asbestos. Has this situation been considered with military exposure?
Yes, it has. And our research that we did looking at the armed forces, if you ask anybody in the armed forces about asbestos, they'll always say, oh, it's the Navy and submariners. And that was the general belief, that naval people in the Navy and submariners were the most at risk. What we discovered was that the actual incidence correlates with the size of the force. And it's actually Army we saw more people with an Army background, followed by the RAF, followed by the Navy, and then and then the other smaller forces. The evidence that we had, we took it to the MOD. It took a lot to get inside the MOD, and eventually it was the health and safety team within the MOD, who are civil servants, they're not armed forces, and they embraced everything that we presented and agreed to work with us. Then COVID happened, and they had to shift their focus to keeping all of our armed forces safe through the COVID pandemic. But true to their word, they came straight back to it by about mid 2002, and they made asbestos a priority. They did a full itinerary of the armed forces, identifying where the asbestos was. They identified certain component parts that literally cannot be replaced at the moment because there isn't an alternative that's asbestos free. But generally, they have taken on board everything that we've said, to a point. I have to say, there are other things we'd like to do that they haven't done. So yes, absolutely. I think our research exposed that it wasn't just the Navy, and all of those things that you've spoke about there have been considered.
Great, thank you. So we've got our final question, Liz, and that is from Alexander. And they want to know, are you applying any pressure on the government to adopt the lower control limits that the EU are looking to implement?
So we aren't directly, if I'm honest. So we started to dip our toe into that kind of campaigning a couple of years ago. And what we discovered was that we don't, we're very NHS and treatment care and patient focused. And it's a bit dangerous to start spouting and campaigning for something that isn't your bag, really. But we work really closely with the asbestos industry and the experts in the field. And what we've found is that when we work together on these things, there is, a much bigger impact. So we don't campaign directly, but we support those experts that know a lot more about that than we do.
Thank you, Liz. I'm sorry I was lying before. There are actually 2 more questions.
Oh, that's okay. As long as you're all right, then I'm fine.
Yeah, we're all good. Thank you. So John wants to know, will the presentation be sent out?
So I think you're going to send out the recording.
We are, yep.
But I'm a bit. We kind of safeguard just for branding and all the rest of it, the content and the slides and the video footage. If any of you want to get involved with the charity, then please do contact us. And we've quite happily worked with some of our corporate partners to help them with the content of their training and education materials.
Thank you, Liz. Yeah, that's great. So final question. Why does the UK have the highest numbers for mesothelioma when all the asbestos in the UK has been imported? And that question's from Anthony.
So I guess it's a bit the same as what I said previously, that we're very good at capturing data on our cancer diagnoses. And we live longer. So we have, people live long enough for the asbestos to cause havoc. And it's just the density of our population and the degree of exposure is indiscriminate. Anybody in our country, because we literally do live on top of each other, our houses are with our schools, our hospitals, so nobody's spared being exposed.
Yeah. Oh, thank you so much, Liz. That's the end of our session for today. So I want to just say again a very huge thank you to you for sharing your expertise with us, and also a big thank you to everybody for joining. We really hope to see you again at another UKATA webinar very soon. Before I say goodbye, I would just like to inform everyone that our UKATA conference, full of engaging and inspiring speakers, is fast approaching on the 26th of June. We actually have another representative from Mesothelioma UK joining us there, so we're very much looking forward to that. And everybody that's in attendance today at the webinar is going to receive a special discount, which I will email out to everyone along with the presentation later on today or tomorrow. So thank you, everybody. Goodbye.
Thank you for the invite. Thank you.
Thanks, Liz.
Bye.
Bye.